Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci pour être venu aujourd'hui avec nous. My name is Safia Hafid, and I will be your host for today. First of all, I would like to start with the land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that Carleton University, which has been integral to hosting this conference, is located on unceded Algonquin territory, which is home to the Anishinaabe Nation. This conference was made possible thanks to the Young Minds Grant provided by the Canadian Department of National Defense and the help of the CDSN. Today, we will be discussing the emerging bipolar system in international relations between China and the United States, as well as Canada's place. There have been many recent and ongoing developments that prompted me to feel this topic was a pressing issue in today's world, and that we should be discussing Canada's role and its foreign policy options. Developments such as the situation with the two Michaels, the US-China trade war, China's Belt and Road project, the situation around Taiwan, etc. Now, for this conference, there will be three panels: the decline of American hegemony, China's current foreign policy tactics, which will start at 2:15 p.m., and the third panel, which is Canadian foreign policy options and the aftermath of the AU-US agreement, which will begin at 3:30. We have great speakers lined up for each panel. The way this will work is that each speaker will present their topic with slides that will be both shown in French and English, depending on the live stream you choose. After all the speakers have presented, there will be time for questions, and we encourage everyone to engage with our presenters. If you have any questions, feel free to start typing them in the chat as soon as you have them. Remember that there's both an English live stream and a French live stream so that you can choose to watch the one you prefer. For panel one, we will have Dr. Elizabeth Freund Larus from the University of Mary Washington speaking, followed by Dr. Bob Murray from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and then Dr. Thomas Christensen from Columbia University. Also, for our speakers, for those with PowerPoints, when you're ready to move on, just say next slide. Our AV team is also able to go back to a certain slide if you want, both during your presentation and the question period. Without further ado, I will let Dr. Elizabeth Freund Larus take the stage with her presentation, American Hegemony and Risen China. Dr. Elizabeth Freund Larus is the Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at University of Mary Washington in Virginia, United States, and president of Larus Consulting, LLC. She's an expert with decades of experience researching and analyzing the domestic politics and foreign relations of Taiwan, China, and Japan. Her areas of interest include the cross-strait relations, maritime security issues in the Asia-Pacific, and US foreign policy in East Asia. She's currently conducting research on US naval diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific. Dr. Elizabeth Larus, you now have the stage.
Thank you very much for having me here today. All right, so as you can see from the title slide, the title of my presentation today is actually American Hegemony and Risen China. This is not a typo here, so you can guess my thesis. It questions if America is actually in decline. Certainly, you probably know that China, since the US pulled out of the Vietnam War, has considered the United States to be a wounded hegemon. However, international events since then have made China's leaders reassess. For example, the US performance in the Gulf War in 1990-91, the US performance as part of NATO during the Balkan Wars, etc., where the United States continually surprises China. So China still believes that the United States is a wounded hegemon, but maybe not so wounded, and its decline is going to be gradual and take longer than the Chinese leadership anticipated. So now let's go to what would be the first of the text slides, titled China Rise, US Decline. Okay, so here you can read a quote from Michael Beckley and Hal Brands from an article that they wrote in Foreign Affairs just in October of 21, and that there's plenty of evidence to support China's view that the United States is a wounded hegemon and that it is a power in decline. And in particular, the debacle of US withdrawal from Afghanistan only supported that view that the United States is a wounded hegemon. It's not the power that it used to be. So let's go to the next slide, US decline. Okay, so here I just bullet pointed some examples instances that we could draw and say, yeah, the US is in decline. That supports that thesis. By the way, this presentation is not exhaustive. We could certainly have a lot of discussion later about US decline, China's rise. Okay, so what are we looking at here? Afghanistan, there was no way to describe it other than a debacle. That withdrawal was a mess, and it looked, the United States looked very bad. But you probably know that the US society is not, in harmony right now. Drugs are a huge problem. Crime is a problem. I'm sure you saw the protests in 2020 and 21. US economy, we have huge inflation problems going into stagflation. 20% of economists now are saying we're headed for a recession. Okay, and then we do have a shrinking military. The United States, yes, we are around the world 24/7, 365 days a year, but with fewer troops, and it is becoming harder to recruit military, troops for our military. And then US diplomacy has been lacking in Southeast Asia and in Europe. And so these are all things that certainly the CCP can point to as evidence of US decline. So the next slide is titled, "Is China a risen power?" Notice I use the term risen, not a rising power. This is a thesis that you may have seen thrown around recently, and I think it is a very interesting one. Okay, and you can read, "We have often heard of America's decline, China's rise, but has China plateaued?" Okay, so the question that I'm asking today and I seek to answer is, has China actually peaked? Is it still rising, or has it risen? Next slide, please. This is peak China scholarship. Okay, so Beckley and Brands in that Foreign Affairs article argue with some evidence that they present that China has peaked. It has plateaued. It was not going to rise further. Okay, and so I just, for academics there, I listed, a couple of scholars, one other than myself, that had published actually several years ago on this topic. Salvatore Babones had published in, again, Foreign Affairs, but we're talking, let me see, what is that, like 11 years ago, Middling China. And his thesis, his argument was that China would grow old before it joined the Club of Rich Nations. And then he came back with a book called American Tianxia, which is a response to that idea of China Tianxia, all under heaven, that the United States would still continue to be the dominant power worldwide. And then also I published a textbook, two editions, where I also, discuss this thesis that maybe China is not going to continue to rise so much. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, elements of national power. Students will recognize these elements of national power from particularly Morgenthau, but also Organsky, Kumar, Palmer and Perkins, and other scholars. And so this is how I am evaluating elements of China and US national power. So let's go through these because I know there's very limited time. Okay, so next slide, please. Natural resources and agriculture. I don't have to tell you China's problems with, not just air pollution. We know smog, we know fog, but actually China's worst environmental problem is actually water. And China's rivers are drying up as well. So most of China's water is undrinkable. It is unsuitable for life forms. It's also drying up. It's being used to irrigate farms. So it's polluting farms, it's polluting produce. And then also China can possibly looking at a problem of food scarcity. China does not get as much wheat and grains from the Ukraine as Egypt, Turkey, the Middle East, and Africa. But with that shortage, there is going to be tremendous demand for grains. Okay, so the pollution problems, which is a natural resource issue, can really hurt China and prevent it from rising so much more. The next slide, please. Population and demographics. Again, I don't have to tell you this, okay? China is becoming old before becoming rich. Right now, China is classified, that is, the World Bank classifies China as a middle-income country. To enter the rich category, per capita income needs to be about 13,000. China's close, about 12,000 and some change. Okay, but they're not there. Look at that demographic pyramid. Look at that's China in 2018 is on the far left, And then on the China graph there, China 2050 is that right, you can't even call it a pyramid. What is that, a stupa? You know, you can see, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words. You can see where this is going. It is becoming old. All right, so now look at the United States. The United States is aging too. Look at 1960 and then 2060. Ooh, we're going to be in trouble in 2060. However, we're already rich. We are already there. When you look at the NICs, remember those, the newly industrialized countries from the 60s, 70s, 80s, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, they were, and then Japan before that, they were able to become rich because their demographics, their populations were growing. They had much younger populations than China has now. So, you know, population is not just mouths to feed, but it's human capital. If you do not have, you know, increasing human capital, the young people, then that's going to hold the economy back some. Next slide, please. Dimensions of power. Let's look at economic power. Look at the United States and China. China's the world's second largest economy. Wow, after 30 years of double-digit economic growth, they are the world's second largest economy. However, there is a big difference between $22 trillion and 17.5. You know, it's in my mind, or isn't that kind of about the same? But when it comes to actual dollars, there's a big difference. Now, the really big difference is the GDP per capita. Look at the United States, 69,000. That number actually surprises me, to be honest. But okay, per capita income, and again, it's a statistic, okay? But it's 69,000, almost 70,000. But look at China, it's 12,000 because of the huge population. China is thriving on trade. That is a very good dimension for China. But its debt is very big, okay? It's 270% of GDP. Wow, gotta get a grip there. Okay, now it is bringing in a lot of FDI, but not as much as the United States. At one point, China was bringing in more FDI than the United States, not recently, partly because of COVID, because of the way it's standing with Russia, you know, in this Ukraine war, for a lot of reasons. It's not drawing in as much, okay? The COVID lockdowns, I don't have to tell you, is going to take a toll on the Chinese economy. And right now, I do not anticipate Xi Jinping will drop the zero COVID policy before the 20th Party Congress, which meets in 20th Party Congress, which will be held in Beijing in October. He has staked his reputation on that zero COVID policy. He's not dropping that, so it will have an effect on the economy. Whereas the US, yes, we have 1 million people dead from COVID. The economy is kind of slow, but it's growing, yeah. Hopefully. Jury's out on that one. Bring it back to that one. Okay, military power. The United States global firepower rank is #1. Then Russia's #2, largely because of the number of nuclear weapons that it has. And China ranks #3, not too shabby, right? This is where, you know, China can really shine in its military power. China has the largest Navy in the world, the largest military now in the world. However, it does not have that presence 365 days a year, 24/7 around the world. Also, United States has alliances. You know, we've scared them a few times, you know, with our commitments, but we do have alliances. China has like an agreement with North Korea. It's not a true military mutual defense alliance. It has no true military defense alliances. And we're going to see this as being extremely important for China if it continues to claim South China Sea and the Western Pacific. Let's go on to the next slide. Military power, which is continued. Now, the base of new military, the pace of new military base construction in the Asia Pacific has been noteworthy because China is militarizing the Asia Pacific. Yeah, the United States already did it, right? We did that after World War II. That's why we've been the dominant power in the region, but we're not building new bases there. Matter of fact, we are, we lost Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base from the Philippines in the 1990s. So we actually have fewer bases there. Yeah, we've got that rotational Marine group, you know, up in Northern Australia, but that's about 2,000 Marines on a rotational basis with some increases now and again. Okay, and so China, and out in Solomon Islands, signed an agreement, and so we'll see if there are bases, coming from there. Cambodia, there might be a base there. Okay, so that is something, that's a dimension definitely to watch. Geography, the United States has been blessed with geography. We have Canada next door, the gentle giant. We have no problem with Canada. Mexico, another great country on our southern border. And then we've got two oceans. We're so lucky. China has, oh my gosh, I don't know, last count, like 18 neighbors. It has pacified its boundaries, I should say. Its relations with most of its neighbors is peaceful, much more than it was during the Cold War. However, it does have a lot of neighbors, and a lot of neighbors that are friendly to the United States. So if China wants to expand its presence, it's going to bump into a lot of countries that are allied with the United States. And again, the United States still has a presence there. So the more that it pushes its claims in the South China Sea, is it driving China's maritime neighbors closer to the United States? I don't think a lot of, particularly the ASEAN countries, are going to enter formal alliances with the United States, but it might tilt them more towards the United States. One country, of course, to watch now is the Philippines, with President-elect Marcos coming in. He appears to want to have better relations with China, but also wants to maintain relations, of course, with the United States. Next slide, please. Diplomacy. Okay. The United States, I think the United States could have done better with its diplomacy in the last 6 years. But China has tried this wolf warrior diplomacy. That term comes from the movie Wolf Warrior, which was a smash hit in China. This to me is reminiscent of the 1980s. Remember that book that came out, The Japan That Can Say No? China is saying, you can't just keep wagging your finger at us. But China did it in what was received as an acerbic way. And that made people skittish of Chinese diplomats and what Chinese diplomats are saying. You can see Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian, I'm sure we're quite familiar with him. He is very blunt in his response, and it has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, partly because they're just not used to this, but also these wolf warrior tactics. It takes a very, very sharp tone. And again, China is trying to get its story out, saying that the West does not portray the China story fairly. And so this has driven, Europe to be, somewhat skittish of China and back over perhaps more to the United States. Okay, next slide, please. Now we're getting down to government and leadership. I think China actually has a very good hand here. China has, as we know, a centralized government. It is stable. It is consistent. The Communist Party's policies actually have been very consistent over the decades. Yeah, there's been reform and opening, and there's been a lot of, changes. But if you look at the policies, you look at the party itself, they've been very, very consistent over the year. A centralized government can more easily initiate not only initiate policies, but implement them. The United States, we have different presidents every, 8, possibly 4 years. I'm sure that's very confusing to the rest of the world. And they come in with different policies. This appears very erratic. It is hard for a centralized government to understand American democracy. It's difficult for Americans to understand American democracy. So this is very confusing. And also, American policy can then be very erratic. And you have seen American democracy be very messy. And that's a polite way of putting it. And so as a result, there is this inconsistency in policy. There are policy lags. Our political institutions as of this moment are still strong democratically. However, a lot of Americans have lost a lot of faith in our political institutions. That is a problem when your citizens lose faith in political institutions. As far as we know, there still is a lot of public support for the government. We are aware of protests in Shanghai and other places on the zero COVID policy. However, overall, the leadership, the public appears to support the leadership. Okay, let's move on. So the next slide I'm trying to get to is soft power. I think the United States still runs away with the soft power if I would compare it to China. Most countries, most people around the world, not all, admire American democracy, our human rights, look at immigration patterns. A lot of people, if they have a choice, would emigrate from their country and immigrate to. It is still the United States. It is the top country when people are polled if they can respond wherever they want to go. China did a very good job with the, the Confucian values, resurrecting the Confucian values and the Confucius Institutes. A lot of those are closing in the United States, but they're expanding in other countries, particularly in the less developed countries where China can have a lot of influence. China, we know, is an economic success story without being a democracy. So if you want a centralized government, an authoritarian government, you can look to China as a very good model. China was gaining a lot of admiration, I would say, up until, the three things, until reports came out about China's treatment of Uyghurs, out in the Northwest in Xinjiang province. Also, Hong Kong shutting down the protests there and implementation of the national security law. And then the third one that I think probably had the most impact was COVID, and not coming out and coming out, first of all, and saying we've got this SARS-like thing going around, and then second, denying that it was humanly transmissible, and time was lost there. And then not being open when WHO, sent over a delegation. So China lost a lot of mileage there. And now, I'm not saying that China is siding with Russia, because actually China has done a number of things to support Ukraine, but publicly it has not denounced the Russian leadership and it never talks about a Russian invasion, into Ukraine. So they're losing some admiration that they had actually gotten before. And then the Wolf-Warrior diplomacy isn't helping a lot. Okay, next slide. I know this is teeny weeny, maybe you can, make it bigger on your computers, but again, this is, hey, here's proof, okay, that, if people have a choice, they want to come to the United States, Germany. Hey, look at Canada, number 3 there, okay, because everyone loves Canada, right? All right. So finally, views of China, again, just some empirical evidence to say that now, it's not just the United States, but a lot of people in the developed world, right? You can see a lot of these countries in the developed world, unfortunately for China, have a negative view of China. This is very different than from about 5 years ago. Most of these countries about 5 years ago, had a very good impression of China. Okay, and then to wrap up. Well, you can read, right? And of course, I'm an American. I try not to be biased in my research, but, what I found in doing this and looking at, your national elements of national power, the U.S. economy is still number 1. It's still a democracy, despite the problems that we have had. Our global firepower is still number 1, even though we have, it appears to be a shrinking military. We still have the alliances. We need to strengthen those. And we still have diplomacy, not just our State Department, but also through NATO. And we do have good relations now with NATO and with the European Union, which is extremely important. China is strong. Is it going to get stronger? It's the world's number 2 economy, GDP-wise. Sure, it could grow larger than the US's, but not on a per capita basis, right? World's number 3 military. Let's see the next few months, couple of years, how Russia comes out of this conflict, okay? China could replace Russia as number 2 in terms of global firepower. It's number 1 in population, but India will soon exceed the population, China's population, will decrease. What China has going for it, though, is phenomenal technology, innovation, and manufacturing are world-class. They will probably, with a shrinking population, move more toward automation, robotics, and China's very good at that. So the jury is still out on this. I'm just not convinced that China will continue to rise. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative, and we're so happy that you could come. And now we will have Dr. Bob Murray with his presentation, Canada and the New World Order, Opportunities and Challenges. One of North America's leading authorities on public policy and politics, Bob Murray serves as Senior Advisor at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. In his thriving practice, Bob counsels public sector and private sector organizations from a wide range of industries on strategic development and planning, organizational change, crisis and issues management, policy analysis and development, labor relations and collective bargaining, risk analysis and mitigation, and governance and government affairs within Canada and globally. Dr. Bob Murray, I will let you have the stage.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Safia, thanks again for the invitation, and also thanks to the CDSN folks for supporting and putting this together today. Pleasure to be talking with you today, and I'm in the middle of between two fantastic speakers. My question that I'm going to deal with primarily is that question that was driving the conference, which is, where does Canada fit in this rivalry, and what are we going to be looking at in Canadian foreign policy moving forward to be able to help navigate these changes in world order, and also this complex relationship between China and the US moving forward. And so I think one of the things that I started with in thinking about this, and that I always start with, is what do we actually trace back in Canadian foreign policy to help understand how we're operating right now and the options that are available to us. Building on Elizabeth's presentation, and we're looking at taking a look at the capabilities and power of two major powers moving forward. Canada does not exactly square up in those areas when we're looking at how Canada would fit into that very complex relationship. And so getting into that next slide, please. Starting with the last time that there was a bipolar structure, what did Canada look like on the world stage? How did Canada behave internationally, and what were the ways that it actually pursued its goals and interests that we might be able to learn from, and looking at the way the world is going to operate moving forward? And so one of the primary concerns for Canada in the last iteration of bipolarity, and of course, which was the Cold War, was this idea of how to forge an independent path in a bipolar structure while also enjoying the constant protection of the US as a superpower. And so Canada was always interested in making sure that it had an independent foreign policy. I think there's a lot that assume that Canada's foreign policy during the Cold War and bipolarity simply just followed the US. And we know that's not true. We know that Canadian policymakers coming out of World War II, the early days of the Cold War, and throughout, we're incredibly preoccupied with trying to figure out how it was that Canada was going to be able to forge a level of independent foreign policy while making, of course, its strategic alignments very clear as being with the US. So born out of that, of course, is the famous concept that really Canada helped define, and that has been built on for many years, and now we're seeing employed by a number of countries throughout the world, which is middle powermanship. So we know that Canada was not a great power, not a minor power, and so the challenge was, and the challenge really remains, how to find space to operate in a very complex international system through the political, diplomatic, and economic capabilities that Canada has, all of which rank very high on the international stage, without the harder military power. And while we can rely through certain alliances on the US for that level of protection to augment our hard power limitations in Canada, the idea of this middle powermanship and the decision to go and to pursue a path as a middle power throughout the bipolar structure of the Cold War provided Canada with unique opportunities. And I think what we've seen is those unique opportunities and the identity that was formed throughout the Cold War for Canada as a middle power has remained constant in the culture and perceptions and narratives around Canadian foreign policy. We've seen recent studies done that say that most Canadians still accept, and this idea of middle powermanship resonates with Canadians as to how our foreign policy actually operates and the place that we occupy in the world. And Canadians largely assume that we're doing the same things now that we were doing 50 years ago when it comes to our foreign policy, despite a number of different changes. So also through that concept of middle powermanship, there were really two elements that were interesting that I think are going to become relevant again and have been relevant in Canadian foreign policy throughout the last number of years. This idea of a twofold strategy of protection and projection, as I call it. Protection, of course, of national security and self-interest. Naturally, we saw the security environment of the Cold War meant that that idea of national security was of the utmost importance, and we saw where the alliances and allegiances for Canada were as to how to go about pursuing that idea of national interest and national security. But then there was also this element of projection, where we were talking a lot about values and norms. And those values and norms included things like peacekeeping, things like anti-landmine treaties, and pushing forward on a number of different normative concepts that we saw even the US was not interested in talking about throughout the Cold War, because we were able to talk about it differently. But more importantly, we occupied a unique space in that we were able as Canada to talk about these things and project norms because we had absolutely no expectation whatsoever we were going to be able to enforce them. And so this idea that we were able to actually raise ideas and to convene forums to talk about ideas in a very safe way that we knew that others were going to come to the table. And this idea of a convener was even mentioned recently in Canadian foreign policy by the Foreign Affairs Minister as to how it is, Global Affairs Minister, excuse me, as to how we're doing business in the world. And of course, in terms of how to go about pursuing this idea of protection and projection, the primary tactic of our foreign policy advancement was multilateralism. And again, so the use of formal alliances like the UN and NATO, et cetera, but also informal diplomatic alliances and multilateral alliances to be able to advance our national interests. And our foreign policy is largely known for the use of multilateralism. And there's a significant amount of work that has been done on how multilateralism actually became the cornerstone of how we pursued middle powermanship, not just during the Cold War, but since. And of course, moving to the next slide, please, when we look at what happened at the end of the Cold War and we enter the unipolar moment where we have the US as a hegemon, we see Canada more closely aligned with the US on a number of different fronts. We certainly saw in 2001 working with NATO and going to Afghanistan. But overall, the relationship between Canada and the US when it comes to foreign policy sees a great deal of alignment over ideas and actions. The notable exception, of course, being the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where Canada decided not to pursue the invasion, primarily under the auspice of it being a violation of international law and outside the approval of the multilateral institutions that Canada holds so dear in pursuing its foreign policy. One of the other pieces, of course, is that because we had a unipolar moment driven by the US, having a Western hegemon allowed for Western norms to become more central in foreign policy making. Whether they actually translated into practice, I don't think we have enough time to move through that full debate, but things like human security in particular, and this idea of transitioning from peacekeeping to peace building. We saw a lot of that conversation as to how that was going to take place and how that reflected Western norms, and exemplified in some ways through the responsibility to protect doctrine starting in 2001 and adopted by the UN in 2005. The growth in free trade and free trade regimes, free trade becoming an intrinsic good for us to be able to pursue with allies in other countries and other alliances to be able to push those Western norms throughout the international system. Throughout the unipolar moment, of course, multilateralism remained central as our means of enacting foreign policy. Though our role in formal institutions began to change, we saw that, again, that transition into talking a lot more about peace building, interventionism. We talked a little bit about Afghanistan, looking at the no-fly zone in Libya as well, for instance, and more coalitions of the willing, taking a look at how the role that we were playing in some of those variables and some of those events, and also how it was that we were using multilateralism. I think the character of multilateralism changed. It allowed us far more freely to operate, knowing that there was that strategic alignment with the US normatively, and that the US was going to be able to project itself more freely than certainly it was during the Cold War. But ultimately, I would say that during the unipolar moment, one of the defining factors of Canadian foreign policy is we became lazy. We became incredibly apathetic in our foreign policy. And I think a lot of this had to do with our proximity and relationship with the US, meaning that we didn't have to try as hard. what allowed Canada to navigate the Cold War years successfully in its foreign policy in many ways was this idea that we were deliberately forging a path through a middle power type mentality and very strategically using our place in the world to try to pursue national interests as well as more global interests. It was deliberate, given the security environment and given the interest in having a more independent foreign policy from the US at times, meant we really had to put a significant amount of effort into forging that foreign policy. There was a clearer vision. We saw work done, certainly in the onset of the Cold War, around what type of role Canada was going to occupy in the world, and the strategy followed from that vision. In the unipolar moment is really the beginning of the turn in Canadian foreign policy to a lot of talk without the requisite action to be able to reinforce it. And that laziness has really started to crept into Canadian foreign policy, and is something that has continued to endure as we look forward on Canadian foreign policy. So moving to the next slide, when we're talking about the evolution in world order, and it's particularly how to start dealing with whether it's a rising or risen power in China, referring back to Elizabeth's take in her presentation, one of the things that we know right now in the limitations is Canada does not have an international strategy. We have a lack of clarity around goals, interests, tactics, and preferences for foreign policy. We know we want to do stuff, and we hear a lot about wanting to do stuff. We know that we stand for a lot of the things that the U.S. stands for, particularly when the U.S. informs us that we're going to need to stand for those things in line with the U.S., but not having a very clear international strategy limits our ability to actually function in an evolving world order. And that shift toward a rhetorical foreign policy without consistent action or a consistent plan, vision, real policy initiatives really has led other states to take us less seriously. The idea that Canada would lose its bid for a UN Security Council seat mainly because we didn't take the campaign for that Security Council seat terribly seriously. Other countries did and were more successful. And so I think we've reached this point in Canadian foreign policy where there's a unique challenge for us to have to think through as the US and China rivalry continues to grow and continues to evolve. And the rise of a non-Western great power like China poses a unique challenge for Canada. How to engage China constructively as Canada independently while not automatically being seen as a U.S. proxy. If we revert back to that Cold War strategy and bipolarity, that independence allowed Canada to navigate very clearly. We're not as independent as we were. As I said, we got lazy during the unipolar moment. We went along with the U.S. a heck of a lot more. So now that we have a different international structure, and how are we going to engage is going to be interesting for Canada to have to navigate. So what we know is that the return of bipolarity and the ongoing evolution of bipolarity has not been met with strategies that are going to make us successful in a bipolar structure. And really, even our cornerstone of multilateralism, we've started to become laggards in our multilateral institutions, that we're willing to talk through issues, but our contributions and lending to these institutions, to missions, to initiatives has been in decline and being questioned by other nations. And so moving to the next slide, please, specific to this question around China, one of the challenges for Canada in this relationship and finding its way in between China and the US is that it took us way too long in Canada to see China as a potential rival rather than a market and trading partner. We were working very hard to believe that we were going to be able to constructively engage with China. Even as the US relationship with China was becoming more complicated, Canada was working differently. Canada had a very different view, and we were pursuing very different policy goals. Recent tensions, I think, have demonstrated that we need that shift, whether it's the two Michaels, whether it's some of the other variables that we saw, and this leads to the question, are we on the verge of a trade war? Well, we see the participation in TPP2, and we also, I think, saw really the challenge for Canada in navigating that relationship during the Trump administration, as the Trump administration in the US ramped up its pressure on trade against China. And Canada was caught in a really interesting position where it was really expected to go along with the US side of things, and yet having to navigate its own interests and our own economic interests and political interests with China, demonstrating really clearly that we were still coming to grips with the idea that we didn't have our own clear vision and policy towards how we were going to engage with China. The US and China relationship is largely going to determine Canada's outcomes, opportunities, and likely tactics. We are not going to be able to simply say, as Canada, can't we just be able to move forward and do what we want to do? The answer is going to be no. We're going to have to operate within that broader structure and find that way. But on that vein, in order to do that, I think it's imperative that we go through in Canada an international strategy review. And to be able to account for this shift in order, that lack of vision and lack of coherence is hurting us actively in the way that we engage with the world, and especially as the relationship between the US and China and Canada and China becomes more complicated. And so we know that China is increasingly challenging American and Western power, and we have to be able to not only understand what that threat means, but how we're going to respond as those threats are going to be able to evolve. So moving to the last slide, I would say that bipolar structures require really careful consideration of foreign policy strategies and tactics, especially for middle powers. The fact that we're currently rudderless as the world order evolves and we have no clarity means that there's a real challenge, a fear that we're going to be left out or taken advantage of. And those are things that we definitely don't want. So while our options may be few as a middle power, we're not going to have nearly the options that other powers would have. It's important for us to see and engage China for what it is and to strategize accordingly as we look to move forward. And so I'm happy to leave it there.
Thank you so much. And finally, we will have Dr. Thomas Christensen with his presentation, Tensions Across the Taiwan Strait and Challenges for U.S. Policy. Thomas J. Christensen is the Interim Dean and James T. Shottle Professor of International Relations and the Director of China and the World Program at Columbia University. He arrived in 2018 from Princeton University, where he was the William P. Boswell Professor of World Politics of Peace and War, the Director of the Princeton Harvard China and the World Program, and the Faculty Director of the Masters of Public Policy Program and the Truman Scholars Program. From 2006 to 2008, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, with the responsibility for relations with China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. His research and teaching focus are on China's foreign relations, the international relations of East Asia, and international security. Dr. Thomas Christensen, you have the stage.
Thanks a lot, Safia. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to the other panelists. I'm going to start by saying I never really liked the word hegemony. It's important to know where states sit in terms of relative power against each other for sure, but hegemony always implied to me that the most powerful state in the system can get whatever it wants in all or most contexts. And I don't think that's ever really been the case for the United States. Even in the peak of Cold War power for the United States in the early Cold War period, the United States was not capable of getting everything it wanted around the world. And I studied that period pretty carefully. Think about the Korean War and all the problems the United States had, even when it was very much in the lead during the Cold War. So context really matters. And in that spirit, I'm going to focus on cross-strait relations between mainland China and Taiwan as a major challenge for US policy and for US national security. From a global perspective, for reasons that Elizabeth laid out already, the United States is much more powerful than the PRC. The United States has global military power projection. China simply lacks it. The United States has the global reserve currency, which is a great source of American power, and it's been demonstrated since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It has 60 plus allies and partners. China has none of these characteristics, including the military power projection, if you take missiles out of the equation. The problem for the United States is that the places where the United States and the PRC are likely to clash and to come into conflict are very close to China and very far from the United States. So geography is the most important factor here. And the most important example of such potential flashpoints is Taiwan. So Taiwan is only 100 nautical miles off the PRC coast. And without any pretense of global power projection in the conventional realm, China can put at risk Taiwan. It can put at risk US regional bases that might be used to come to Taiwan's defense. It can put at risk forward deployed forces at sea and in the air of the United States. And it can put all of the US allies and partners in the region at risk with its current military capabilities, which are developing and getting stronger year on year. Beijing hopes with this growing military capacity to deter, delay, or defeat US forces that come to Taiwan's aid in a conflict. So deter the United States from coming to the assistance of Taiwan, delay American assistance if it's decided to send forces, and then defeat those forces if they are sent. And you'll be familiar with a lot of the military capabilities that Taiwan's developed. Sophisticated missiles, both ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, submarines, many of which can fire such missiles, air defenses, very sophisticated air defenses that cover most of Taiwan, anti-satellite weapons, cyber weapons, and a modernizing nuclear force. China has a very good, very strong hand to play in cross-strait relations. But the good news from a US perspective is that attacking Taiwan for mainland China, it would still be very costly. There are a couple of major military options for China in a cross-strait conflict. One would be invasion. An invasion, if successful, could be decisive, but it's extremely difficult to launch an invasion of Taiwan, even though the mainland is much more powerful than Taiwan, and even though the US has to come from a distance if it chooses to come to Taiwan's aid. It's even more difficult to invade Taiwan than it was for the Russians to invade Ukraine, because sea and air invasions are much tougher than land invasions. So I would think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Russia's poor performance to date in that invasion must give some Chinese leaders pause about the dangers and risks of an invasion, despite the fact that there's no question that the mainland China is more powerful than Taiwan, and a big challenge to the United States in that regional context. A second option is a blockade. That's relatively easy for the mainland to launch against Taiwan. It's much harder for Taiwan or the United States or any of its partners to break, but it could be a very prolonged process. A blockade could be very costly to mainland China. It risks escalation with the United States, and it gives the United States time to intervene if it chooses to do so. And it gives the United States a chance to intervene on Washington's timetable. And there could be very big economic costs for the region and for China, which is integrated with the region. And the potential for very harsh sanctions to include the United States and its partners, maybe Canada as well, must be sobering to Chinese leaders, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when the United States, its allies and partners have been relatively united in fairly harsh sanctions against Russia. So all of these challenges that the mainland China faces in dealing with its problems with Taiwan mean that deterrence of an actual attack is still possible, but it's becoming more difficult. The circumstances have to be right to successfully deter a mainland Chinese attack on Taiwan. And those successful elements of deterrence are credible threats on the one hand, of punishment, and credible assurances. And both sides are necessary in order to have successful stability across the Taiwan Strait and successful deterrence. On the credible threat side, the US needs to have a credible intervention plan if a US president were to decide to intervene in a cross-strait conflict. And that probably requires more dispersed mobile forces that can fight from longer ranges, because China's current military capabilities are putting at risk forward deployed bases, especially large bases. And the United States is going to have to be more nimble and able to fire more ordnance from a greater distance and have more mobile forces. You need to have enough defense capability on Taiwan in advance of a conflict and enough strategic reserves of critical materiel so that neither an invasion looks attractive and a blockade looks very costly. And again, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine so far has helped on this score, get people's attention to the idea that the Taiwan military needs to be prepared in advance, it needs to be well stocked, and the Taiwan society has to be well stocked to hold out in a long-term struggle. And that might make Taiwan a tougher nut to crack in the future. There has to be credible economic punishment. And again, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has helped on that score in terms of the credible threat side of the equation. But what a lot of people forget when they think of deterrence is that deterrence is twofold, and it doesn't just involve credible threats. It involves credible assurances. The threats need to be conditional on the target, that the target doesn't get punished even if it maintains the status quo. And we have to be careful in our relations with Taiwan, on the military front, on the political front, not to cross Beijing's red lines. And it's my opinion that there are certain things that the United States and Taiwan could do together that would make deterrence impossible, that the mainland would feel compelled to use force against Taiwan under those circumstances. So it's important, for example, for the United States to not support Taiwan independence, and it's important for Taiwan political leaders not to pursue permanent legal independence from the Chinese nation if war is going to be successfully deterred in the future. And I think despite all the criticism of US policy on both sides of the aisle in Washington, I think the US strategy towards cross-strait relations has been fantastically successful for the last decades. And it has been successful because it's involved some key elements that balance the need for both credible threats and credible assurances together. And those are commonly known as strategic ambiguity, about just under what conditions the United States would intervene. We have the Taiwan Relations Act, which calls for two things. One is the supply of defensive weapons to Taiwan, and the other is the maintenance of a capability for the United States to come to Taiwan's assistance militarily if the president were so to choose. It's not an obligation, but it's an obligation to stay prepared. And the United States in that light has maintained a very strong military presence in East Asia and is often in the process of rethinking that and rejiggering it and strengthening it. The United States at the same time has had a one China policy to include no support for Taiwan independence and no restoration of a formal US-Taiwan alliance, which existed in the Cold War from the 1954-55 period until 1979-1980. And by doing so, they've provided the assurances that make deterrence work. So what worries me now about the US-PRC strategic competition is not that the PRC has somehow caught up with the United States overall around the globe, but that for a combination of military and political reasons, it's more difficult to maintain the success of that policy towards cross-strait relations that has been so successful in the past. And the factors that make it more difficult are the military factors I discussed before, a lot more PRC military wherewithal than before, that really challenges forward deployed US forces. Chinese nationalism and assertiveness. Xi Jinping has emphasized two things that worry me. One, he has constantly emphasized the need for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's not a new theme, but he has put much more rhetorical muscle behind it. And he has also linked progress on unification with Taiwan as a prerequisite for progress on the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And that Chinese nationalism links up badly for stability purposes with growing Taiwan nationalism. No one on the island, almost no one on the island of Taiwan wants unification with the mainland, peaceful or otherwise. And the numbers of people who want unification with the mainland is going down, not up. So the trend lines are dangerous from the mainland's perspective. And this is only more true after Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has made the PRC look more frightening and the prospect of attack more palpable to the public in Taiwan. The US, for its part, is very concerned about China's rise in general. And there are political trends in the United States that are drawing what I consider to be somewhat simple conclusions from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And one of those conclusions, it existed before, but it gained in currency, is the notion that somehow Taiwan can be used as a tool to contain China's growth or rise. This is a very dangerous concept for Taiwan's own security because there's very little to do. There's very little that can be done to protect Taiwan in a conflict from severe harm, even if the U.S. were to intervene.
Dr. Thomas Christensen. Thank you very much. I think if it's possible to stop now so we can have time for the question period.
Okay, if I could just add
Yeah,
a couple
course.
more points. So there's a tendency to blame China for a lot of U.S. problems, and that feeds into this. And there's a tendency to call, and especially on one side of the aisle, for clearer commitments to Taiwan. And I think those clearer commitments, if they were actually implemented in the future, perhaps in 2024 with a new election in the United States, and there'll be a new election in Taiwan, it seems to me that those types of policies are unnecessary, because the Chinese military already expects and plans for a U.S. intervention. So there's no need to clarify that strategic ambiguity that's been in there in the past. And the second thing is a lot of the proposals would restore what appears on the mainland to be a U.S.-Taiwan formal alliance. And that's always been a precondition on the mainland for relations with Washington, normal diplomatic relations with Washington. It's also been a precondition on the mainland for keeping the peace. So I worry about those trends in the United States. I worry about the upcoming election in Taiwan. But I think that the policy that's been in place has been extremely successful and could be into the future, because a conflict across the Taiwan Strait is still very costly for the mainland and is not something that I think the mainland is eager to partake in the future. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you everyone. And now we will have the question period. So we already have some questions. So the first question for Dr. Elizabeth Larus: why do you think China's COVID lockdowns are persisting longer than the rest of the world, including the United States?
That is an excellent question. It is because of Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy. China started this zero COVID policy back in 2020, and they have kept it for 2 years because Xi Jinping, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, has staked his reputation on it. Now, okay, so imagine he drops it, how catastrophic it could possibly be. Most of the elderly in China are still not vaccinated. China started vaccinating younger people and working age people. A lot of the elderly are not vaccinated. People in China who are vaccinated have been vaccinated with the Chinese vaccination, which its effectiveness I've seen could be questionable, right? It appears to prevent death, but people can get sick. Okay, so imagine the effectiveness is not so great, and COVID then is widespread and people start dying. China does not have the hospital facilities. The United States has about 26 doctors and hospital beds per 1,000. China has about 6. On any given day, Chinese emergency rooms are filled with people who are there for either catastrophic illnesses or something like a sore throat, because most people in China do not have insurance other than for catastrophic causes. And so if they are sick, they wait to the last minute, and then they use that insurance, but they're very, very ill. So the same thing probably would happen with COVID. And so there would be a lot of deaths, and Xi Jinping cannot have that on his reputation. He is not going to lift it. You know, never say never. And I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I would put money on him not lifting zero COVID until after the 20th Party Congress, and probably not until 2023.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was a great answer. And for Dr. Bob Murray, doesn't Trump make it easier for Canada to identify a distinct independent path?
Yeah, good question. It should have. That absolutely should have served as the wake-up call that Canada needed, especially looking at what happened to Canada being dragged very quickly into a US-China bit of tension and the challenges that were posed and what it did to our relationship with China. Doesn't seem to have actually taken hold and led Canada down a path where we were going to suddenly learn from that, recognize the need that we were going to have to do things and be able to move those things into a new era. So I think Trump was supposed to be that ultimate wake-up call, not just because of the China piece, but because of other pieces as well. Watching the US retreat from multilateral institutions and traditional bases of how Canada pursues its foreign policy posed a challenge for Canada to have to start asking itself what happens in the international system and in a world order where the US may not actually have our back the way that we thought that it did. Trump era ends, Biden gets elected, and we really haven't seen any substantive change to Canada's foreign policy since. And so I'm not sure if it's that we're just taking too long to learn from it or we've chosen not to, but certainly we haven't seen that progress that I think we should have seen coming out of that era.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you so much for your answer. And now for Dr. Thomas Christensen, what do you think Taiwan is learning from Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
It's a great question. We know some things that certain people in Taiwan are drawing the lesson that a weaker power with the proper asymmetric capabilities and preparations can really hamper the progress of a stronger military. There is a debate in Taiwan about what kind of military equipment to purchase and what kind of military doctrine to adopt. And there's been a big push in recent years under President Tsai's leadership to adopt an asymmetric approach, more of an all-of-society approach, and more emphasis on things like mobile missiles that could be shoulder-held. And there's been pushback against that from some more traditional defense interests. And I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine will strengthen the hand of the argument that Taiwan needs to rethink its approach to long-term defense and the kinds of ordnance that it should procure and the types of training that it should undergo. And I personally think that's a good thing for them to that conclusion is the right conclusion to draw. And I think they will also draw the conclusion that they need to have stockpiles of weapons to hold out. Because again, the one thing that the mainland has a huge advantage on would be blockading Taiwan from support after a conflict starts. So you'd want the Taiwan military should want to have stockpiles of equipment in advance of a conflict. So it's a great question. On the other hand, I think that there are people in Taiwan who say, well, the United States is unwilling to fight in Ukraine because Russia has nuclear weapons. And some people might draw the conclusion that the United States would not intervene in a cross-strait conflict. I don't think that's the correct conclusion to draw from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but I can understand why the mainland is playing that up in its own social media manipulations in Taiwan, and why certain political elements in Taiwan have emphasized that point.
Okay, thank you so much for your response. And I think we have a few more questions. For Dr. Elizabeth Larus, hypothetically speaking, if China were to become the dominant power, do you think China would export communist policies to the rest of the world?
Not communist policies the way Karl Marx defined communism. He used the term communism because he wanted a really strong term, a politically loaded term for really socialism, which is an economic system, which means the state owns and controls the means of production, or the people own and control the means of production, which means the state does. So I don't think that China was going to export economic communism, economic socialism. However, I think that if China were to become the dominant power, that China would export what I would say is the principles of Leninism, and that is government that is run by a small force, the vanguard, right, of the proletariat. So there will be a very, very small elite crack group that will lead the people, and everyone must follow without dissent, because there only can be one leader. And so not only would the leadership of the country be very, very small, would power be in the hands of a few people, but those few people would be organized hierarchically. The way we see the Chinese Communist Party is organized: the General Secretary, Standing Committee, Politburo, the Central Committee, and then the party membership. And so I have absolutely no doubt that if China were to become the dominant power, that the things that they would export would be centralized government, power in the hands of a few with no ability really for dissent. So goodbye, freedom of speech, freedom of protest, the political and civil rights that people enjoy. That is what they would export.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for your answer. I think we have time for one final question, and then we will go for a break. So, question for Thomas Christensen. The US Department of State website removed the wording that Taiwan is a part of China and that the US does not support Taiwan independence. Why did the state do this, and is it provocative?
I'm not sure why the State Department changed its website. The website was a little bit misleading. The website that was the website wording that was changed was a little bit misleading to the broad public. And the website never said that Taiwan is part of China. It said that the United States acknowledges the Chinese position, that there's one China and Taiwan is part of it. And that has been the traditional US position, actually, not just in the communiques going back to 1972, but also in US foreign policy going back to the beginning of the Korean War in 1950, which is that the United States takes no position on Taiwan's sovereign status in relation to mainland China, but it does not support Taiwan independence. And it calls for peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences in a way that is compatible with the interests of people on both sides of the strait. So that's the foundation of the ambiguity policy strategic ambiguity policy that I talked about before. But it hasn't been the case in the past that the United States said that Taiwan is part of China, and now it has stopped. It has been the case in the past that the United States has said the United States does not support Taiwan independence. Now, it would be a radical change if the State Department said, we're considering supporting Taiwan independence. They didn't do that, but they removed the general reassuring statement that the United States does not support Taiwan independence from the website. And we could speculate about why that's the case. It's probably the case that the Biden administration doesn't want to look like it's being weak on Taiwan in relation to China, and therefore, why mention something for which you could be criticized? So just leave it out. So I don't think it constitutes a change in policy, but it constitutes a change in diplomacy in a sense, in that you're leaving out part of your longstanding policy from the public discussion. And you asked about the reaction on the mainland. The reaction on the mainland, predictably, has been very negative. They have said that this is, basically supporting one Taiwan, one China, and so on, so and so. But it's not unusual for U.S. public pronouncements on cross-strait relations to lead to reactions on the mainland, but this one led to a predictable type of reaction. I personally think the United States should leave in that language of do not support Taiwan independence, particularly as we go into the 2024 election. President Tsai in Taiwan has been a great leader, in my opinion. She's been very strategic, very moderate. She has avoided provocations to the mainland that might lead to a military crisis. But I don't think she's highly representative of her own party, the Democratic Progressive Party. And there are much more radical elements in that party. And she is forbidden to run for office again under the Republic of China Constitution that reigns over Taiwan. So she will be replaced in her own party by other elements. And the question is, will those other elements be as moderate as she is? Will the electoral competition lead to more radical statements? And will cross-strait relations get more tense? And then on the US side, in the same year, 2024, we're going to have an election. And it's really unclear who will win that election. And we know that, Mike Pompeo has said that the United States should recognize Taiwan as a nation. And we know that John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor, says the U.S. should station troops in Taiwan, a large number of troops, basically forming an alliance again. And I personally think that either of those policies would cause a war. And my basic rule of life is you can't deter a war by causing one. And I return to the point that no matter how many forces the United States throws at the problem, there's nothing the United States can do to protect Taiwan from severe harm. So my other saying about this is that all Americans love Taiwan. Some Americans want to love Taiwan to death.
Very well said. Thank you so much for your answer. And now we'll be going for a brief break and coming back for panel 2 at 2:15 p.m.
Thanks to all. I'm sorry I have to go early.
No, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And have a great rest of your day.